Tonight's guest is Phil. Phil, welcome to the show.
Hi, Vic. Glad to be here.
Well, it's great having you. Phil, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
Well, I grew up in the forest of Wyoming and Colorado. I've been there almost every day my whole life. I've been in the forest one way or the other, and I've seen quite a few things, but nothing like I saw the night that you and I talked about. I make rustic and log furniture, so I spend a lot of time running around grabbing pieces of wood that have the kind of character that I'm looking for. So I've seen quite a few things in my life out in the woods. I've seen mountain lions, bears, black and brown. Seen wolves. I've seen lots of wolves out where I go. So quite familiar with the shape of their heads and the way that their tracks look. You know, I spent all my life in the woods and never seen anything like I saw that night in 2011.
Oh, I'm sure you hadn't. Yeah, that's definitely a game changer. Phil, you take exception to the appellation Dogman. Please expand on that for us.
What I saw, I think the term Dogman implies that it's somehow less feral than the thing that I saw. I've been looking into different werewolf and dogman mythos across, and I came across the fact that Wolf Creek Pass is named by a guy that was a trapper there that saw these wolf-like creatures, and I always found it interesting that it said wolf-like. It didn't say wolves. It said wolf-like, so that's how the name of Wolf Creek Pass came about. And I just find that really interesting that mythos dates back that far. Somebody saw something like what I saw that far back. And the Ute Indian tribes of the area have extensive stories about skinwalkers, and that they are an evil entity or a malignant force. And I've looked back over my memories. I've poured over my memories since you and I talked, because before I talked to you about Dogman, my really only frame of reference would be like in the movies, a werewolf, or maybe stories of like the Loop Guru or something like that you see on like Unsolved Mysteries or any of those, cryptid shows. And what I saw, I think about it back, and especially after looking in its eyes, what I saw was definitely not in any way just a feral animal that had been cornered or anything like that. It was a calculating, thinking, and a feeling that I felt inside me when I saw it was the same kind of feeling that I had while looking into the eyes of men who wanted to kill me. I've had that unfortunate experience in my life, and the look in that creature's eyes is exactly the same as seeing somebody who was a multiple murderer looking at you. And since I talked to you the first time, I've saw a lot of stories where the Dogman was even almost approachable. This thing is not the thing that you want to approach. It's a 100% killing machine. Every ounce of it geared towards dealing out just ridiculous amounts of damage. The teeth on it alone, it looked more like a snake than a canine, but the face was obviously very canine. They were so sharp. I clearly remember that. The night was very clear.
So that I don't put words in your mouth, are you saying that the word Dogman discounts them? It cheapens them in a way?
This one, I can only speak on this experience. I've never seen anything like this. I'm 51 years old now, and I've been in the woods since birth. And I mean, I've seen Bigfoot tracks and all kinds of things that most people would never even think about being able to see in the wilderness. And it never crossed my mind that other than in a movie theater, I would see anything like this. And some of the descriptions that I've heard of other dogmen really leads me to wonder if there are other species of dogmen that are more aggressive, kind of like in the dog world. There's obviously more aggressive dogs than, you got poodles and like a cane corso, for example. And I wonder if, like you and I had talked before, that there's a large enough group that could support different personality types across certain packs or groups of these things. But this one would definitely be of the very dangerous and malignant nature. A skinwalker would be about the closest thing that I think I could come to labeling this thing, because the way that it looked just was so unnatural.
From the way you described what that dogman did when you saw it that night, I don't think you could describe it as being exactly affable, to say the least, unfortunately. Are you mad at that dogman in a way for taking away the innocence from the outdoors, from nature, that you had before you had that encounter that night?
No, I'm not really mad. Honestly, I feel kind of honored that even though I felt like it would kill me in an instant, it clearly was a thinking, calculating animal on the par with humans or apes, I would say. It calculated, and it calculated that it was a good idea to fully show itself to me, because it could have stayed in the same position that I originally saw it and not stood up on two legs, and I would have just maybe have thought, wow, that was the hugest wolf I've ever seen. But it calculated when it looked me in the eyes when it was first on all fours and then stood up, that it was going to show itself to me fully. And I don't know what his goal in that would be, other than that in nature, animals try to appear larger than they are, which is really a joke when you're talking about something that's 10 feet tall. But it definitely did the whole "I'm a threat to you" dance that I've seen in nature quite a few times. And it's very, very effective when you're looking at something like that.
Oh, sure, it's effective. Like I say, it's all fun and games until the dogman stands up, and I've got no doubts he did that just to get a response out of you. I think it's as simple as that. If you've had a dogman encounter and would like to speak with me about it, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. If you've had a Bigfoot sighting and would like to be a guest on one of my 2 Bigfoot shows, please go to mybigfootsighting.com. All right, Phil, please tell us about your encounter now. Give us every last detail that comes to mind.
Well, it was in the middle of summer in July, and it was a full moon in 2011. I had worked all day in the woods, ironically, picking wood for a bed that I was going to make. And so I was really in tune with the sounds of the forest and stuff like that from being in the woods all day. I returned home at about 4:30, 5 o'clock, and my wife and her friend were getting ready for a trip that we had planned to go on to one of her friends' weddings, which was down in Pagosa Springs. It's gorgeous down there. Lots of really tall pine trees, lots of really fragrant underbrush there, like sage, and lots of berries at this time of year. So you expect to see bears and things like that walking around on the road because it's just easier. And it's such a remote area where Wolf Creek Pass is located that you can imagine seeing quite a few different animals. I've seen moose there before. I've seen all kinds of things. Mountain lions. I've seen a pack of wolves down there. And they're not supposed to be there, ironically enough. But I've seen them overlooking the valley off of the same overlook. I always stop there. It's one of my favorite places. But we loaded up and we're driving in my wife's friend's minivan. And I was driving, doing all the driving duties, and the ladies were doing all the party prep duties. I've never really been a drinker. I've never even had a single cup of coffee in my whole life or smoked a single cigarette. So I'm always the designated driver, so I was driving. And we drove all the way through Colorado, no incident. And everyone fell asleep. My 2-year-old son was in the car, in his car seat at the time. Ironically, his name's River Danger. And they were all sleeping, and they were sleeping pretty heavily, I guess. By the time I got to Wolf Creek Pass and came over the Continental Divide, I saw how gorgeous the full moon was. It was such a nice night. You could smell the pine in the air, and it was just an idyllic drive for me. It was so quiet, which is a rare thing for me being a father. And just the ideal drive that you could possibly think of. And when I got to the Wolf Creek Valley pull-off, I decided to pull off the road, and I had to just take in the view and stretch my legs a little bit, take care of things. And I don't know, I was overlooking the valley with the full moon. It was like 11:30 at night, and the moon was pretty high up in the sky, so it was lighting up almost like day, the whole valley. And you could see all the Wolf Creek running down, feeding all the plants and everything along the side, and you could see all the forest off to the side, away from the water source. And there's a lot of open fields there. There's a lot of game there. There's pristine mountain water. And it's a really ideal place for wildlife to live. So I guess as a place to live, that would be an excellent place if you were something like the Dogman. And like I was saying before, Wolf Creek Pass is named after a guy that I believe he was a French trapper that told stories about seeing wolf-like creatures there. And, this all plays in the back of your mind, but none of it really registers to you until you see something. They're all just stories until the proof is in front of you. But as I was out there stretching my legs and everything and looking at the valley, at the hair on the back of my neck and this hair on the back of my arms, my hackles went straight up. Like, my spidey sense started tingling. And for some reason, I just decided, nope, I need to get out of here. It was the most uneasy feeling I can ever remember having in my entire life. And I got in the van and I rolled down the window, and I was looking outside because it was really bright out, as I said, and it was pretty easy to see. I mean, you could see almost as bright as day. It was one of the brightest full moons I've ever seen. And I don't know if it's just because it stands out in my memory because of the event that happened, but I always remember that as the brightest moonlit night that I've ever known in my entire life. Anyway, I was looking out the window, and across the way was rustling in the bushes. And I was like, a deer or an elk ran across the road, because there's tons and tons of them there. You can hear them all calling in the background at night. And at that point, I decided just to drop it into drive, and I pulled out, And as I turned on the lights, probably about 100 yards down the road, I saw a large black figure running on all fours. And my very first thought was, oh wow, is that a black bear? Running along the side of the road in plain sight? And I was getting ready to wake up my son so he could see it. But luckily I did not. I kept my eyes on it and I kept going. And I kept seeing this glint of red as it was probably looking back behind it as it was running. And there was really nowhere for it to go. It could have gone across the front of me and gone off the cliff, which at that point was pretty sheer. And then on the other side, there was a pretty sheer cliff that it would have been probably not very difficult for it to climb, but a whole lot less difficult than just running down the side of the road. But as I picked up speed a little bit and got a little closer, because I really had no fear of driving past a black bear. But as I got closer, I noticed that the tail was much longer than a bear tail, and it looked more like a canine tail. And at that point, I also noticed that the hind legs had a distinct back knee, like a dog has or a horse. The gait of it really reminded me of a horse. And its legs, I noticed, were really spindly looking for how large they were. I also noticed that the body was really large, much larger than a black bear. I would say it was easily bigger than any grizzly bear I've ever seen up in Yellowstone or anything like that, body mass wise, but it was weird. As I pulled up even closer to it, I noticed that the body was kind of curved, almost S-shaped, like over itself, and then it came back out to the front, what I thought were legs at that point. But the hair on it was so shiny, like a Vidal Sassoon commercial almost. It was not coarse. I was expecting to see the coarse hair of like a bear, but it kind of really mostly reminded me of a long-haired cat. How smooth and supple it was. It was not coarse in any way, and I was literally, this is a 2-lane highway, and I was right on the yellow line in the middle of the road, and it was just off the road on the dirt in the shoulder. So we were at this point, as I was pulling up next to it, probably about, I wouldn't even say 15 feet. I would say 15 feet would be being generous if I were to guesstimate how wide that lane was on the other side over to that shoulder. And as I pulled up right next to it, in the periphery of the lights, it turned and looked at me. And from that moment on until the end of the encounter, our eyes never unlocked from each other. It started slowing down, and I noticed that in the periphery of my headlights that its eyes were glowing like a red color. It was really spooky. But I could see through the glow, I could clearly see eyes that were very, very human-like in the way that they gathered information, the way that they were calculating, and it kind of hiked its back legs up under its body, which kind of made it a little bit smaller looking. It kind of tried to shrink in on itself. But at that point, I had realized that on the top of the head, like if you were looking at like a German Shepherd or anything like that, right there was the largest and tufted ears on this animal that I had ever seen, and glowing red eyes. This thing was pitch black. There was not a shred of any other color I could see on it at this point. No lighter black. It was just pure darkness with red glowing eyes. And the tufted ears were swiveling and you could clearly see him swiveling towards me, like it was trying to listen or gauge what was happening to it at that point in time. And you could see even on its face the dawning of the realization that it had been seen, without a doubt had been seen. And that's when it did something that I will never forget in my life. This moment is burned in my mind more than any other moment of my life, more than my child's birth, more than my wedding vows. I mean, before this moment, it could have done anything other than what it did. And I could have left that situation with some kind of plausible deniability about what I had seen. But at that moment, I could see it made its decision. And it fully showed itself to me by standing up on two legs. And as it stood up and its body uncurled, because the mass of it was easily, like I said, as much or more than a grizzly bear. And this mass started unfurling and just standing up higher and higher. And as it did this, I heard the distinct sound of it sounded like a mix of joints popping and bones cracking. But this thing stood up, and there's a sign right next to it at this point in the road where it pulled off, because it was kind of like a pull off on the other side. And that I measured that sign on the way back home, and it was 9 feet. And as this thing stood up, its head was easily a foot over the top of that. It could have rested its arm comfortably on top of the sign that was next to the road. And I never unlocked eyes with this thing the whole time it was doing that. And as it stood up, the wind kind of gusted towards me, and the smell that hit me as it stood up was this really musky, it smelled like a wet dog and death. And, oh man, the fear at that point as it fully stood up in the full moonlight with no questions on what I was looking at. I was in complete disbelief. And it's at this point where any rational person, I would think, starts questioning if they are going crazy. Are you seeing exactly what I'm seeing? And that came out vocally. I said, is that a werewolf? And I said it out loud. It obviously heard me, and it nodded its head as if to say, yes, you're looking at a werewolf. And that's also one of the reasons why I think the term Dogman just falls short of describing this creature. And what I saw directly in front of me was a wolf-headed, 10-foot humanoid creature. And at that point, he stood up and fully opened himself up, throwing his arms out. The closest thing I can think of is a guy, that some drunk guy saying, "What, you want to fight me?" And then holding his arms out in a threatening manner, which probably falls back to the whole nature thing of making yourself look bigger. But it showed me exactly how big it was. And its torso was so long and lean at the waist. It was like it was wearing a girdle almost. And then the haunches on the side of the legs were just huge. And so it went down like a V, and its buttocks just were huge. And then human-like thighs. And at the knee, it had a human-like knee, but then it had another knee or a reverse ankle. But its foot was probably, I don't know, the foot portion of it, it was standing on the balls of its feet, and the length of the foot went back, and that must have been the back of its ankle. Then it went up to a human-like knee, and I could clearly see that. And then it opened up its hands, and they were clearly hands, and they had claws on the end of them that were definitely made for killing. And I'm not sure, but it looked like it had some kind of flesh hanging off of one of the fingertips of the claws. And it just stood up and looked at me like, what are you going to do? That kind of look in its eyes. And I was just frozen. I couldn't wake anybody up. I couldn't move. I've never felt the feeling of immobility before from fear. But that happened. That really happened. And that's one of the things that never sat right with me after the encounter, because I have never been put in a position where I could not react. And we just stood there looking at each other. I was just taking this thing in and trying to rationalize any other explanation than what I was seeing. Anything. Anything that I could rationalize this with, I would have grasped at like it was a life preserver, because I was drowning in disbelief at this point. There was nothing that I could relate this thing to. This sheer size of it, I think, was the most intimidating feature of this animal. But as I was looking at it, I could see that it had clearly had a dog face, clearly had the dog's ears, but they were very tufted, more like a cat. The fur on the neck was slightly longer, kind of like a mane. The hair on its shoulders and chest was a little bit thinner at the chest and a little bit thicker at the shoulders, so it kind of had this bristled out look. Maybe its hackles were up too. But it had this very bristled effect that it had on it. And then as you got to the chest and to the stomach, it had almost no fur. And that's the only discoloration in the whole body of the thing, other than the palms of the hands, which were the same color. But it was also a black, but it was more of a grayish black, like a very dark skin color black, very dark. And the hands were the same, kind of like a gorilla's skin, really. The hands really looked like, kind of like a gorilla's hands, because the muscles on each part of the finger were so exaggerated that they were like half a barrel each. They were huge. And the arms were, even for the height of this thing, the arms were much longer than you would see analogous on a human. Like our arms don't hang, they hung almost to its knees. So they were really long. And the muscles, the muscles were very sinewy. It was very skinny looking, like it was gaunt. But each muscle was massive, like a bodybuilder, and its chest was like a huge barrel. Just a terrifying creature. The teeth on it, they reminded me, they were so sharp, and at this point it had its mouth open so I could clearly see, and its lips had curled back a little bit as it was growling. And I could clearly see these teeth. They were like needles at the bottom, but they were probably about, I would even say 6 inches long. They were about half a foot long. They were huge. And then on the bottom, they had a similar number of teeth. And the closest thing I could think of is like, I don't know, maybe a movie dragon's teeth or a snake, like a rattlesnake's front teeth. They were so sharp. And at this point, it started growling. The growl was so low that I could barely hear it, but I could feel it in my chest. I could feel it in the seat of the car. And just looking at this thing was getting more and more terrified, like every second, with the realization that this is not something that's of your imagination. You're not seeing things. This is something that is right in front of you. And I could see it in its eyes that it was calculating what it was going to do. And as it was doing that, it did the strangest thing. It started bobbing its head in like a figure eight motion. It was very mesmerizing because I'm looking in the eyes and I'm following it. And we're both kind of like, our heads are kind of bobbing side to side in a figure eight pattern. And then it stepped out onto the road. And right at that point, as I heard the nails click on the asphalt, it's like snapped me right out of whatever trance or stupor from shock that I was in. And I mashed that gas pedal to the floor so hard that I'm shocked it didn't go through the floor. The tires started screeching and peeling out, and nobody woke up. Not one person in my car woke up, batted an eye. All this is going on. My tires are just screeching, and I'm jetting out of there. And luckily it's going downhill because it's a minivan. It doesn't have that great of a takeoff. And it started running along the side of the road on two legs next to me, and it kept up and looking straight at me the whole time and growling. And it kept up pace with me, like mile for mile, right up until I hit 30 miles an hour. It started to lag behind just a tad, and then it dropped back to all fours, just like instantly, like one stride, two legs, boom, the next stride it was going on all fours. And it caught up to me and kind of pulled ahead just a little bit and was looking back at me like it was going to jump. And right then, the van shifted into just a little bit higher gear, and we hit about 50 miles an hour. And then as I hit about 55, going on to 60, it started falling back. And I looked up in the rearview mirror and in the side mirror, watching it the whole time. It was still very clear night. I could still see it very clearly. It stopped, stood up on two legs, and howled. And that sound chills me to my bones to this very day. If I just remember it right now, it makes the flesh on my arms go up. And it sounded like the scream of a man mixed with a lion roaring is about, because a wolf growling, or even a bear, like maybe even a bear sounds real similar. Like the mix between a bear growling and a human screaming. It was hair-raising, literally. And then I saw it in the rearview mirror jump off the side of the road, because at that point the slope was a little bit less, and the creek was between that and I was coming up in a bend in the road, and it went around. And so I saw it jump off, and I went around the bend, and I just kept going as fast as I could. And I think what that thing did was it cut across the stream, across the bend, and jumped up on the other side to try to intercept me on my way around. But I was going too fast. And as I looked up, as I was pulling around the last bend before Pregosa Springs straightaway, I'm pretty sure I saw it go onto the road on all fours and then turn around and go back. But that's the last I saw of the Dogman, werewolf, skinwalker, whatever you want to call it. I don't know. What I saw was definitely, it looked exactly like, there was a movie back in 1984 or so called The Howling. It looked exactly like one of those werewolves in that movie. I've heard people describe as the movie Van Helsing, the big black werewolf on Van Helsing. And I would say that is a close approximation, but I also say most of those people never saw the movie The Howling because they're too young. Because the wolves in The Howling are pretty much what I saw, except black and 10 feet tall. And I mean, the clarity of it, the closeness of it, there's no question at all. There's nothing that I can rationalize. There's nothing anybody could tell me that, oh, you probably saw a man in a suit. Well, men in suit don't stand 10 feet tall and run 55 plus miles an hour. And yeah, like I said before, I feel a little bit honored that it displayed itself to me in a way. And it doesn't make me afraid to go out into nature, because I always figure if I die in nature, at least I'll die doing something that I love to do. But I definitely would never go out in the woods looking for that thing. Like, any of those monster hunters or anything like that think they're froggy, I can tell you right now that you are not. You can send a platoon of highly trained and armed with the latest of the latest weaponry, and this thing would mow through them like they weren't even there. The amount of shock that I was experiencing afterwards, I just couldn't even speak. We made it all the way to the Pagosa Springs wedding, which was an outdoor wedding where we were going to be camping on our friend's farm. And it wasn't unreasonable to think that something of that size could easily cover the distance from where this happened to Pagosa Springs. And if it's like a wolf or a dog that's tracking something, what's to say it couldn't follow your scent? That whole night, and like I've said before, I never had a cup of coffee in my life. I don't drink. That night was an exception. I got drunk. That's probably one of the only times, other than in college, a few times that I ever got drunk. And definitely the only time that I ever got drunk enough to have a hangover the next day. But what I had saw affected me to the core of my soul, to the point that at night, if I dream about it, I wake up in a cold sweat. And there's nothing that I've ever seen that was as dangerous as what I perceive that to be. And I do realize that maybe this experience was colored by watching too many horror movies as a kid or something like that. And I do leave out the possibility that it did not mean me harm. But I really do think that thing meant me harm. And just the look in its eyes was exactly the same as looking into the eyes of a human killer. That 10,000 yard stare, that dullness, that calculation, exactly the same. And that's why the term Dogman, I just do not think sums this creature up fully. Werewolf, I don't even think werewolf is sinister enough to describe what I saw, to be honest. But I guess that's about all I can really fully remember about that I would be. I mean, maybe some questions would prompt a little bit more, but that's about as descriptive of my event as I can be. It was long enough that there is no question. It was close enough that there was no question about what I saw. Completely sober person at the time, so there was no interference or intoxicants that could have made me see something different than what I saw. And I guess that's just never sat right with me, because whenever I've seen anything else in the woods, it just feels natural. They're supposed to be there. This did not feel like it was supposed to be there.
Yeah, that's a normal feeling when you have an experience like the one you had. I'm conflicted on this due to some of the things you said, Phil. Would you describe that experience as being an overall good one because you're glad you got to see it, or a bad one?
I think after 10 years, I mean, if you asked me that night, hands down, it would have been a bad one. But after 10 years of thinking about it, I think it's a good one, because I'm a seeker of knowledge. I love learning new things. I've the kind of guy that the cell phone that I was talking to you on earlier is the first cell phone I've ever owned. My wife got rid of my landline and made me get that because she's like, you need to get with the times, because I would be out in the woods, and she's like, what if you get hurt out in the woods and you need to call somebody? I'm like, well, there's no signal out there. So it never bothered me to have a cell phone. So I still read paperback books, and I haven't lost that curiosity that a lot of people have lost with the advent of instant access to information. I mean, you don't have to look very hard anymore to find knowledge, so it doesn't seem that valuable to a lot of people, I feel. And I don't live in that world. I live in the world where I like to learn new things. And learning that there was something real out there, like the Dogman or this werewolf or whatever I saw, was definitely one of the most interesting things that I've ever had the privilege of learning in my life. Even though it was scary, I made it out. So it's not like I was injured or anything like that or have any really bad memories, but I do suffer a little PTSD type attacks every now and then that were worsened by that incident. But on the other hand, like I said, I still think it overall a positive thing just to have the knowledge that that is out there. If for nothing else, to be able to be more aware while I'm out in the forest that something like this could be out there. I mean, I don't know what you could possibly do if something like this wanted to get you. I got the feeling that even a shot from a 3.57 is not going to phase it, just make it mad. So you're not going to win on a brute strength contest with this thing in any way. And as far as being wood smart, I mean, you could be the smartest Indian tracker or anything in the world, but this thing lives in the woods probably 100% of the time. So it knows things that you could never even comprehend about the woods. And if you were to see this thing out and about without being in a vehicle or having some means of escape, it would be a really, really lucky thing if this thing did not want you, because it could have you. You can't outrun it. You can't outclimb it. You can't outswim it probably. It's just the apex. It is an apex predator on a level that I never, ever would have imagined in my entire life existed until that day. And I guess it's just a little unnerving to realize that you are not the apex predator in a situation, any situation, and realizing your fragility is a large part of the fear that accompanies a experience like this, I think.
If having an encounter with the Dogman doesn't expose your fragility, then I don't know what would. Can you watch werewolf movies now, Phil? Now that you had that experience?
I probably could, but to be honest, I haven't sought them out, that's for sure.
Yeah, I can understand that. That does make sense. You told us that you heard the claws on its toes clicking on the pavement when it stepped onto the highway, but how long would you say the claws on its fingertips were?
Oh, they were easily 4 to 6 inches. They were like knives. He reminded me of Freddy Krueger with 2 gloves. They were huge. But of course, the thing was 10 feet tall, so, 6 inches on something 10 feet tall is probably analogous to probably like the size of a bear claw on the end of its fingers, but much bigger than a bear claw just due to the fact that the thing was 10 feet tall.
That is big. How big would you say its hands were? Were they disproportionately large even for a creature that size, or proportional?
They were they were obviously 5-digit, very human-like, but the middle of them, like the palm, seemed to be stretched, probably unnaturally long for the hand size and finger size. Like, it had more palm than you would expect on something with the... I mean, in the fingers, I would even estimate that the finger was at least twice as long as the claw, so they might have been as big as a foot, each finger. But the palm was at least a foot and a half long, as I recall. It just looked unnaturally, the palms looked unnaturally long for like a human hand, and the muscles were clearly defined in the fingers. And I mean, it displayed itself for me. It wanted me, I could tell that it wanted me to have no doubt about what I was looking at, because I was just, I mean, I can kind of empathize if I was just, walking down the road somewhere and somebody just started staring at me. I probably wouldn't be too amused either after the first 30 seconds.
Well, see, that's the thing. It wanted you to stare at it.
Well, it got its wish. It definitely got its wish. It burned. It gave, like I said, it gave me the most memorable memory of anything that I've ever had in my life. I could get Alzheimer's and forget everything else in my life, but I guarantee you I'd never forget that moment it stood up and fully displayed itself. Just burned in my mind. I don't know what memory can even compete with something like that in my head. And I've had a lot of memories in my lifetime. And by far, that's the most vivid memory that my brain revisits over and over and over again.
I'm sure it is the most vivid one. Let's talk about its teeth now. Considering how big and sharp they were, did it look to you like it could have closed its mouth if it wanted to?
It had its mouth closed when I first saw it. When it first stood up, its mouth was closed. The front teeth were visible, just the bottom, probably like 3 inches. They hung over the jaw, kind of like a saber-toothed cat, but the other teeth fit up nicely in the muzzle. The muzzle was huge, though. You have to realize how huge this thing was. I would say its head was probably about 3 times as large as the largest wolf heads I've ever seen. We have a wolf rescue right down the road from me here, so I've seen quite a few wolves. And this thing's head was easily 3 times as big as any wolf's head that I've ever seen. And the teeth, while they resembled canine teeth in the order that they were in, they have the very front ones are kind of spiky, and there's, I don't know, about 7 of them or something like that. And then you got the 2 long fangs that came down. And then you got a whole row of teeth behind that are various different sharpnesses. But this looked almost reptilian. The teeth looked a lot more reptilian than canine to me for some reason. Just, they look very, like they might be kind of brittle, because they were so thin and pointed. I've never seen a canine with teeth like that, that's for sure. It definitely looked more reptilian than canine to me in their thinness and sharpness. I mean, they were like needles. But yes, it could definitely close its jaw. Just the teeth would poke out from underneath its lip line, I guess.
I don't see how you could ever get a sight like that out of your mind, so no wonder you can't. You said it had a bigger body than any grizzly you've seen. How do you think it would fare in a fight against the biggest, toughest grizzly, though?
It could take on 6 grizzlies and they wouldn't phase it. I guarantee you it would rip a grizzly in half. And that's another thing I forgot to say. On my way back, I stopped at the place where it stood up and measured the sign, because I work contractor. I have a tape measure on me at all times. And I really I guesstimated that it was about 10 feet tall when I was looking at it. And I was like, there's no way. So I wanted to measure that sign, and that sign was right at 9 feet pretty consistently. And like I said, it could have rested its arm comfortably on top of that sign. It was standing right next to it. But I went further down the road, and in the road, and I didn't notice it the night before, there was a big, giant pool of blood, like dead center of the road, and then splashes going off into the brush on each side of the road. And I looked over on one side, and there was the top of the shoulders, and about half of a very large elk. Any hunter would be proud to take the rack home that was over there. And then over on the side where I had stopped, on the side of the road, just in this scrub brush, which I didn't see it the night before, if it was there or not. So I couldn't tell you if it happened before or after the fact, but I tend to think it probably happened before I got there, and that I may have interrupted its dinner is probably what happened. But it looked like it literally ripped this thing in half and threw half of the body on one side and half of the body on the other side of the road. It's that strong. And I have no doubt. I mean, it could be a coincidence. Maybe a car hit an elk and split it in half perfectly across the road. But I tend to believe that that was left there by the Dogman as maybe a warning. It looked more like a warning than a meal, to be honest. And yeah, I totally forgot about that. That was really freaky, seeing that. And it was full daylight at that point, so I'm never traveling through there at nighttime ever again.
Yeah, I can understand why. And that must have been awfully freaky to see that. When it stood up, was it too dark to see its genitalia?
No, but you could tell that it was a male, but it had more thicker fur down there, kind of almost looked like pants. The only part that really had any skin, there was like a really thin layer around the eyes, like the eyelids, the bottom of the palms of the hand and the fingers, and then the chest down to probably about the middle of, right at the belly button. And it had a belly button, but on the sides and on the back it had hair. Just the stomach was kind of visible a little bit. That was hairless. But the legs and the hip and genital area was fully covered with fairly thick fur. I would say it was analogous with the mane. I call it the mane because it just stuck out more than the rest of the hair that was on its body. Kind of analogous to the mane, I guess, like around the thigh area down to the knee. And then at the knee, the hair got more, I wouldn't say thinner, but it laid down more so you could see more detail, like more detail of the knee and the shin area you could see. But the hair was definitely shorter there, much shorter, kind of like on a dog. But yes, I could see that it was a male. Especially from the back when it was running, you could see his testicles as it was running. So it was not fixed.
I can only imagine what that sight must have been like to see.
Well, I really thought it was a bear at that point because I didn't at that point see the tail fully because it was kind of tucked over to the side, around the side as it was running. It was like it was trying to disguise itself as a bear, or some. It was used to camouflage, is kind of how I interpret it, up until the point where I saw its tail, because it looked like it was trying to mimic a more natural animal when it was all curled up. It didn't look like it was its natural state of running to me for some reason at that point. When it chased me down the road, its body wasn't in that S-curved shape that I originally saw it on the side of the road. It was fully extended, and it was running completely different than it was running when I first saw it on the side of the road. The gait was totally different between those two.
I'm still trying to get over the fact that you saw his swingers. Wow.
Well, it was. I mean, it was a 10-foot being. It was definitely a male.
I don't doubt that.
He was wearing no pants because his tail needed to balance it. So he was a large, large animal and definitely male.
That he was. Did your encounter affect you strongly enough that people around you could tell you were bothered by something, Phil?
Oh, yeah. Everybody asked me, because like I said, I never drink, and I drank that night, and everyone asked me, what's wrong? What's wrong? And I couldn't say it. I don't know if I was still in disbelief or shock, but I just could not tell anybody. I never told anybody that story except for my friend Robert. He's basically my brother from another mother. And yeah, I never told anybody. And Robert, he's like me. He likes to gain knowledge. He's Gen X, and he likes knowledge. So, and he knows me. He's known me for decades. And he knows I wouldn't just tell him some lame story just to get a reaction out of him or anything like that. He knows that I say what I say and I mean what I say. And so I knew I could tell him. But I never even told my mother. I never told my wife. I did tell my son, who was there when he was 10 years old, about that encounter, because he asked me what was the strangest thing you've ever, because he's really into watching the Expedition X type shows and stuff like that. He's curious about Bigfoot because he's also a child of the forest, and Grandpa told him Bigfoot stories, and Dad told him stories about seeing things. And so he's really curious about that stuff. And he asked me, what's the craziest thing I've ever seen in the woods? And I told him that story. And I don't know if he knew what to think. He kind of knows that his dad doesn't make up a bunch of stories just to get a rise out of him, too, because I've raised him. And I've raised him to be a truthful and honest person. So he knew. So I had no qualms telling him. And then the next person I told was you. I just happened upon one of your podcasts, I think, on YouTube, and it led me down a link. And I just guess I felt it was the right time to tell my story and kind of get it off my chest.
Well, it goes without saying, I'm so glad you did find out about me and you reached out to me to tell me about it. You did tell your wife about it, but you waited years to do so. Why'd you wait so long, and how'd she respond when you told her?
She was like, why didn't you wake me up? And there was no motor function at that point. I couldn't have physically even spoke for about a minute during that encounter, just from the shock of it. And then afterwards, I mean, as a husband, you want your wife to kind of look up to you. You don't want her to think that you're just crazy, because anyone that didn't see what I saw, I wouldn't blame them for a split second to say that I'm crazy. But I saw what I saw, and there was no interpretation for it to be anything other than what I saw. And what I saw is best described as a werewolf or a dogman.
That's right, because that's what it was. If you'd like to be able to listen to the show without ads and have full access to bonus content, that's an option. To find out how, please go to dogmanencounters.com/podcast. Do you count your blessings that your kids didn't see that dogman that night because they were asleep, or do you wish they would have seen it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no question about that, because having that knowledge is a gift for me, but having that knowledge for most people might not be too comforting. And my son was only 2 years old at the time. I can't even imagine a 2-year-old mind trying to process that situation at all. I mean, maybe they're more resilient than I think, but Yes, I am very glad that they were not awake when that situation happened.
Yeah, I figured that would be the case. Do you see that dogman that you encountered that night as being a flesh and blood animal that was just out there doing the best it could to make a living? Or do you think it might have been a supernatural being?
I don't know. It's like I said earlier. My experience with Dogman or werewolf came mostly from watching horror movies and stuff like that. And at the time, and still right now, I kind of lean towards the supernatural, just mostly because in my heart, I mean, it sounds corny, but in my heart, I felt that that was a supernatural event. That I felt it was supernatural in nature. I got the feeling that it did not belong. And when I found Bigfoot tracks, I didn't get that feeling at all. I felt that that was just part of nature. Yes, I just felt that that was a natural situation, whereas this animal, this being, didn't seem natural to me at all. I mostly say that just because of the intelligence that was behind the eyes. Like I said, we locked eyes, and I never stopped looking at it in the eyes, and it was. They were very. Eyes are the window to the soul, and when you look into the eyes of, like, say, a mountain lion that's up there, you can see the predatory nature of it, but you can also tell that it's not a thinking animal like a human is. This, you could see in the eyes that it was a thinking, calculating creature. And that, I don't know, that just sat with me as unnatural, but I've never experienced a dogman before. I don't have any idea what a dogman's habits are or anything like that, like I do other animals of the forest. So I leave room for interpretation that it could be something natural, but as of today, I still lean towards a supernatural presence. And I'd like to think of myself as a skeptic until I see proof of especially things that are supernatural in nature. But, I mean, if you get down to it, anything that you don't understand seems supernatural to a limited mind. And I like to think that I don't have a limited mind. So I'm open to that this was some kind of natural creature that might live out there in large numbers, maybe larger numbers than we are even aware of. But a large enough group of animals to have different personalities. You know, maybe this one was not a nice one, and you know, there's another one that another one met has a totally different personality. I mean, you see that in dogs and cats and everything. Everything has a personality, but I guess I'm kind of more leaning on the supernatural side still at this point. I think, honestly, I would have to have another encounter with one of these things, or have another look at it, albeit from a safe distance. But I think having another sighting of a dogman would be very cathartic for me, so that would make it more, just having that backup would be so great. Or even having somebody else that had that experience to talk to about it would be really cathartic, especially if they had a positive experience with one. I can't imagine there being a positive experience with something like that, but I'm sure that somebody is a dogman whisperer somewhere in the world.
If you do have another encounter down the road, I hope it's not a very traumatic one, so you do have a chance for it to be at least somewhat cathartic. So, I guess time will tell on that. You stressed how vivid that encounter still is in your mind. Do you see a day coming when those details and memories won't be so clear?
No. I mean, unless I get dementia or Alzheimer's or something, I don't see any degradation of that memory ever occurring in my mind. My mind replays it in my head at least several times a week. in my dreams or just in my general thoughts when I'm out in the woods or anything like that, especially when I'm out in the woods. I'm really mindful of really how fragile a human life really is in the face of something like that. So best to be prepared as you can be for something like that. But also going into the forest not being afraid is a big plus for me. And I guess I've made peace with the fact that these things are so rare that I might never see it, or that they're so timid that if it sees me, it runs the other way. Because wild animals, if it is a wild animal, tend to avoid any human contact. They don't seek it out very often. I mean, there are exceptions to the rules. There are animals that just don't care and would roll right over you. And this is one of those. But there's not much you can do about that when you wait. I kind of liken it to a surfer going out and he gets attacked by a great white shark. He's not going to stop surfing.
It goes without saying, I'm so glad you can go back into the woods and do all the things you love to do out there. It really would be a shame if you couldn't do that. Well, it's about time to get out of here, Phil, but before we do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
I hope everybody that has seen one of these things has the opportunity, like I have, to unburden themselves of their experience and maybe talk to somebody that has a more rational view of what these things are than the terrifying experience that they probably had. I would love for them to comment on this podcast with any questions. I mean, I would answer any questions that they put underneath the chat that's underneath there or anything like that. I'd really love to meet somebody that maybe has a recording of one of these things, just so I can compare it to what I remember hearing in my mind. It would also be interesting to set up one of those calls during a full moon night out there with a trail cam and being a healthy distance away from it, albeit. But man, I just would love to be able and be terrified to be able to see that again.
Well, like I said, if you do have another encounter down the road, I just hope it's not a traumatic one. So, like I said, there is a chance of it being a cathartic experience, but who knows? You might have an encounter, but odds are you're not going to.
Yeah, I think that's more of a once-in-a-lifetime thing. I don't think that happens very often, and that's one of the reasons why I felt that it was a positive thing, because not many people get to understand the reality of that situation in a way that I have been able to because of that experience.
Some eyewitnesses do have repeating encounters, but yeah, most eyewitnesses only have one. But having said that, I can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing the details of that experience with us, Phil. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for your time, Vic.
Well, thanks so much for yours, and have a great night.